Good morning. Happy snow day to all of the kids and teachers. It's quiet here at the school because even though we have blue sky here in Sanborn, many of the teachers in our district come from a little further south where the lake effect is dumping a foot or more of snow right now. So enjoy your day off. Thanks for tuning into our weekly reflection on the One Year Chronological Bible here at St. Peter's. This week, we read how Jacob had 12 sons with 4 different women. Rachel, the one he loved, Leah, her older sister, who Laban had tricked Jacob into marrying first, and both of their serving girls. Out of those 12 sons eventually came the 12 tribes of Israel. Laban constantly changed Jacob's wages, trying to get him to stick around longer. But through Jacob's trickery and God's blessing, Jacob's flocks prospered while Laban's dwindled. Jacob decided to head back home with his growing family and all his flocks and herds. They headed out in the middle of the night, but Laban caught up to them a few days later. He at least wanted to say goodbye. Rachel got into the act of the treachery between Jacob and Laban. She had stolen Laban's household gods and sat on them in her tent to hide them. I wonder, what little gods do we have in our own families today? Martin Luther said that whatever our hearts cling to, whatever we look to for all the good in our lives, that is our God. As Jacob traveled with his family, angels of God came to meet him. When Jacob saw them, he said, "This is God's camp," and he named the place Mahanaim. When I was in college, I got to go to a retreat at a Bible camp in northern Minnesota that was called Mahanaim, God's camp. When Jacob heard that Esau was coming with 400 men, he craftily sent some flocks and herds ahead of him as a gift. Then he sent all of his wives and children ahead of him. He himself stayed on the other side of the river, and then wrestled with an unknown opponent all night. The Lord renamed Jacob Israel, which means wrestles with God. And the nation of Israel has wrestled with God ever since. Our Father wants us to wrestle with Him in prayer. He blesses us, even though we don't deserve it. Later, when Esau received him kindly, Jacob said that seeing his face was like seeing the face of God. Our eyes tend to glaze over when we read long lists of names in the Bible, especially when they're repeated almost verbatim right away in another book, 1 Chronicles. But those names tell the family story of Jacob and Esau and explain where important cities and lands got their names. So much of the conflict in the Bible, and still today in the Middle East, is a long saga of family squabbles. We read about some horrible things that happened: the rape of Dinah and her brother's revenge, how Tamar outwitted her father-in-law Judah to provide for herself. And then we read the famous story of Joseph's dreams and how he talked about them. I dreamed that we were harvesting grain and all your sheaves bowed down to mine. I dreamed that the sun and the moon and 11 stars bowed down to my star. A few years ago, our local theater troupe in Iowa did Joseph in the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, which is all about this last part of Genesis. Joseph was Israel's favorite son, and all his brothers hated him for it. Some of them wanted to kill him, but instead they sold him as a slave and made their dad think that Joseph was dead. Joseph ended up as a slave in Egypt. But God blessed everything that Joseph did. He became the right-hand man of his master Potiphar. Potiphar's wife tried to seduce Joseph. When he ran from her, she unjustly accused him and had him thrown in prison. But God blessed him even in prison. He gave him the ability to interpret the dreams of 2 fellow prisoners. Just as Joseph predicted, the baker was executed, but the cupbearer was restored to his place, at Pharaoh's side. He forgot all about Joseph until Pharaoh had some bad dreams. Dreams of 7 fat cows getting swallowed up by 7 skinny cows and 7 plump stalks of wheat getting swallowed up by 7 withered stalks of wheat. Joseph explained that Pharaoh's dreams were both saying that 7 years of plenty were coming, followed by 7 years of famine. Pharaoh decided to put Joseph in charge of everything. He stored up so much grain that during the famine years, Egypt was able to sell grain to neighboring countries. Joseph's own dreams came true. His brothers came to Egypt to buy grain, and they all bowed down to him. He didn't tell them who he was at first, but he found out that his father and his brother Benjamin were still alive. Joseph claimed the brothers were spies and kept Simeon in Egypt, insisting that they bring Benjamin, his favorite brother, to prove that their story was true. He secretly had their money put back in their sacks with the grain. His brothers were alarmed when they found the money. When the grain ran out, Jacob reluctantly allowed them to take Benjamin back with them, along with double the money. The Egyptian manager claimed that their God must have put their money in their sacks. Joseph threw a feast for them and gave Benjamin 5 times as much food as everyone else. When they headed back home, their money was again placed in their sacks. Joseph's silver cup, which he said helped him predict the future, was placed in Benjamin's sack. The brothers were brought back before Joseph, and he finally revealed who he was. His brothers were afraid, but Joseph forgave them and insisted that God sent him ahead of them to save their lives and the lives of so many others. He told them to bring Jacob and the rest of their family to Egypt so that he could provide for them for the rest of the 7-year famine. Tomorrow, we'll read the end of Genesis. We'll hear how when Jacob died, Joseph's brothers were afraid that he would finally take revenge on them. They made up a story about Jacob asking them to ask Joseph to forgive them, but Joseph had done so already. He reassured them that though they meant it for evil, God intended it for good, to save many people. God is able even to work through our suffering and pain for his good purposes. The cross of Christ is the ultimate example of God using suffering to bring healing and new life to the whole world. Well, thanks for reading along in the Bible this week. It's great to be journeying together through God's Word this year. Hope to see you in person or online for worship at 8:30 and 11 o'clock, and adult class and Sunday school at 9:45. Have a great rest of the week.